Hello students and welcome to Online Conversation Club. So today our topic is going to be about New York City. New York, New York, one of America's most famous cities. So let's warm up and go over some city vocabulary. So I want everyone to take 3 minutes and think of as many words as you can that are related to city. Like anything, any word you can think of that would be in a city or that comes to your mind when you think of city. So you can pause the video and come back after 3 minutes. Alright, I hope you guys got a lot of words. So I'm going to go to the next slide and we'll go over some and some new words also. Alright, so you probably all wrote building, right? And skyscraper. Also, have you heard of this word, high-rise? It's another word you can say for like a really tall building. You can call it a high-rise. Also, apartment, which is in British English, they say flat, but in American English, we say apartment. Metro or subway, both words are in English also. For example, in New York City, they call it a subway. In Washington, D.C., they call it a metro. You can also say underground. Bus, everyone knows. What about commuters? Do you know what a commuter is? It's what you describe somebody in a city who's going to work. Basically, everyone going to work in the morning is a commuter. You're commuting from your home to your work. And then public transport or public transportation, it's like anything that you use your Baku card to go on, like the bus or the metro. Same in every city, public transportation. Let's see, outskirts. Okay, so do you know what the outskirts of a city are? It's like the areas that are on the edge of the city. So not the center of the city, but the very edge of the city, the outskirts. Also, suburbs. Have you heard of this word, suburbs? This is usually, every city has suburbs. It's like an area outside of the city. It's not in the city, it's outside of the city, where there are more single houses, not like apartment buildings, but single houses, and it's not like a busy city, but it's also not a countryside. It's just like houses and stores and stuff like that, and people drive from these places to the city to go to work. And then the next word, alleyway. Do you know what an alleyway is? Or you can just say alley. It's like a really tiny street, a really thin street in between two buildings. It's usually a dark street, and no one really goes on these streets except for the people that live there. It's called an alleyway. And what about rush hour? You probably all deal with rush hour every morning and afternoon when you're coming home from work or going to school or university. It's the time of the day when in the city it's so the metro is so crowded, the buses are so crowded, maybe for like 2 or 3 hours in the morning and like 2 hours in the evening. It's the most crowded time of the day to use public transportation, when everybody is going home from work or everyone is coming to work at the same time. It's called rush hour. So there's morning rush hour and there's evening rush hour. And then street vendor. Do you know what a street vendor is? I think every city has street vendors. It's like someone who's selling something on the street, not in a store. They're not in a store. They're outside on a street. They're selling something like maybe they're selling like socks or clothes or also watches. I know in Baku, next to Irmiseki's My Metro Stansiası, there are street vendors. They sell things like that, like clothes, and also food, like snacks. like small food, not like a whole meal. Street vendor. Also traffic, tikhaj, traffic. So it can be like a street and it's just full of cars. There's so much traffic. It's just all the cars, everything in the street is traffic. And sidewalk. Do you know what a sidewalk is? You can see in this picture there's a sidewalk. It's the place on the side of the street where people walk. So it's called sidewalk. So on the side of the street for walking. So sidewalk. It's easy to remember. And then pollution. Pollution is a problem with every city, from all the cars and factories and all the people using electricity. It's just pollution is everything that is harming the air and the environment. Downtown. Downtown is like the center, the main part of the city where like everything is. And then district, you can use the word district to describe different parts of a city, like this district or that district. Like a city can have different districts, it's just the different parts of the city. And then convenience store. Have you ever heard this word, convenience store? It's basically like a small store, a mini market, not a big supermarket, but a small store, and just has like basic things like drinks, snacks, maybe milk or something, but it's not a big store. It's just like a store that's easy to go to. You walk in, you walk out, get what you need. And then nightlife. Nightlife is just every like thing that's for entertainment that's at night. So people talk about nightlife when they want to go like out, when they want to go out to places at night and have like parties and stuff like that. So that is nightlife. Everything that's entertainment, but at night and like out in public with other people. All right, so you can look over these words again. I think some of them might be new for you, so you can write them down and try to remember them. All right, so now I want everyone to answer these questions. You can pause the video and write it down or say it out loud. What do you know about New York City? What have you heard about this city? So just try to think, like anything you've ever heard about New York, or anything you know, maybe you know some facts about the city, maybe you've been there before, you can talk about it. So just try to think for a few minutes and then you can come back to the video. Alright, so now I want to talk about some nicknames of New York City. Do you know what a nickname is? It's basically a name that, it's not an official name, but it's like a name that people call you because of some character trait. Like, people have nicknames. Like maybe somebody calls you something that's not your real name. It could be a mean nickname, or it could be like a normal nickname. So I think just about every big city has its own nicknames too. So like for example, Baku, a nickname of Baku is the windy city, right? It's a really, because you know why? Because it's so windy in Baku in the winter, so people call it a windy city. So New York City also has nicknames. So I want you to read through these and try to think about what these nicknames mean. Why would New York City be called these? And then you can come back and I'll explain it. Alright, so the first nickname of New York, the Big Apple. This one, I actually didn't even know why people called it this before I made this presentation. I've just heard this my whole life. But I looked into it, and the reason why is because a long time ago in New York City, they used to do a lot of horse racing. and after the horses would race, they would give the horses a big apple for a reward. So then people would race horses around New York City a long time ago. So then they just started calling the city the Big Apple because it's where the horses would race. The next one is the city that never sleeps. This one's probably a little easier to guess why. Because there's always people there's always people awake doing something in New York. Like the vocab list, remember the word nightlife? New York City has a lot of nightlife. There's lots of different places that people go at night, like things like clubs or bars or something like that. And people are never sleeping, so they call it the city that never sleeps. There's always lights on, always something going on. All right, and then what about the melting pot? What do you think this means, the melting pot? So, New York City is a very diverse city. It means that there are many different types of people who live there from all over the world. So, when in the US, when we describe a place as being very diverse, we will call it a melting pot, which means like the city is like a pot that you put like food in on a stove and it's melting. So the city has tons of people and they're all mixing together, like melting together, so it's the melting pot. Alright, and then the next nickname. The city so nice they named it twice. Alright, so think about that there is a state in the US that has the same name as New York, and when you put a city and a state together, it's the same name twice. So we're going to actually go over this in a couple slides from now, so you'll see why it's called the city so nice they named it twice. All right, so what about your city or the town that you're from? Does it have any nicknames? And what do they mean? So you can pause the video and you can think about this question. All right, so you might have heard of New York like as a city and also New York as a state. So you know in the US we have 50 states, right? And people always say New York City or they say New York, but they're not talking about the city, they're talking about a state. So what is it? Is New York a city or a state? All right, the answer, it's both. So New York is actually a city inside of the state called New York. So it's kind of confusing, but they both have the same name. So you can see here a map of the United States, and this red part is the state of New York. And then here is another map of New York State, right? So this is the same as the red part over here, right? This is New York State. So you can see Canada is right here and other states like Vermont, Massachusetts, Pennsylvania. And then all the way at the bottom of New York State is New York City, right here, this red dot right here. This is New York City. So New York City is inside of New York State, and when you write it as an address, you write New York, New York. So that's why they call it the city so nice they named it twice, because New York, the address of New York is New York, New York. New York City, New York State. Alright, so let's talk about some basic facts about New York City. So New York City, the whole metropolitan area is about 23.5 million people. And within the city itself, like the center city, it's about almost 9 million people, 8.8 million people living in the city itself. So it's a really, really populated and crowded city. And it's actually the highest populated city in the US. So it's the largest city in the US based on population. And New York City has also been described as a cultural, financial, and media capital in the modern world. So in New York City, it's probably like the center of American culture and also like Western culture. Also the center of finance because the stock market or the stock exchange is centered in New York City. Like maybe you heard of Wall Street. It's like the financial capital, one of the financial capitals of the world. And also media capital. This means like lots of news agencies. Almost every major news agency in the world has an office in New York City. Many American news agencies are based in New York City. So it's a media capital. And also, it is said that New York City is the most photographed city in the world. So people take more pictures in New York City than any other city. Another interesting fact is about 800 languages are spoken in New York City. So of course, most people in New York City speak English, and also a lot of people speak Spanish. But look how many other languages are spoken. Do you know why? Do you know why this is? It's because that 3.2 million of New York City's residents were born outside of the United States. So over 3 million people who live in New York City are from different countries. So that's why there's so many languages spoken in New York. But actually, today in New York City, the most spoken languages are English, Spanish, and Chinese. Because there's one district in New York City called Chinatown, and there are thousands and thousands of people who speak Chinese there. If you go to Chinatown, you'll see everybody speaking Chinese, and there's Chinese restaurants, Chinese culture, Chinese stores. Everybody there is their families came from China like a long time ago, and they still speak Chinese today. All right, and like I said before, it's one of the most diverse cities in the world. So that means there's different people, like millions of people from all over different countries that live in New York. And the city was first founded in the year 1624 as a Dutch settlement, and it was called New Amsterdam. So in 1624, some people from Holland or the Netherlands, the Dutch, they sailed and set up like a little village in where New York City is today called New Amsterdam. And then, of course, maybe you already know, but New York City is home of the headquarters of the United Nations. So the UN has its central headquarters in New York City. And whenever there's a meeting with the UN, diplomats and government officials and representatives from all countries that are recognized in the United Nations come and meet together in New York City. All right, so what about your city or town? Can you make a list of some interesting facts? Like kind of like the facts that I told about New York. You can talk about population, how many people live there, the history, and also anything interesting about it. So why don't you take a few minutes and think about some facts about your city or town, and then come back. All right, so what are the five boroughs of NYC? So this word boroughs, it's kind of like how people say a district in New York City. It means the same thing as district. It's just in New York they use this word called borough. So you probably have heard of some of these before. So there's the most famous Manhattan. this is where like New York City is. This is like the main part of New York City that everyone sees in pictures. It's where all the tallest buildings are. It's where the financial center is. It's where everything you've probably seen about New York is here. Then we also have Brooklyn. Brooklyn is another famous borough of NYC. A lot of people live there, and you've probably seen Brooklyn in like movies and stuff like that. And then there's Queens and the Bronx up here, and also Staten Island. Staten Island, you might have heard of in like mafia movies. This is where a lot of Italian people live, and there's always mafia movies here, like about the mafia and stuff like that. All right. So have you heard of any of these? Can you think of any facts about any of them? All right. So now let's talk about the top sites and attractions in New York City. So what are the most famous things to see, and what are the most famous things to do in the city? So you should take a minute and think about places that you've heard of in New York City. Maybe you've seen pictures of a certain place, or you've heard about a certain place. So try to think about what that is. All right, so probably the most iconic site in New York City and the whole United States of America is the Statue of Liberty. So this is the Statue of Liberty, and she actually is on an island outside of New York City. So you can see New York, Manhattan right here, and the Statue of Liberty is on an island in the water, and you can see it from all around. And this is probably the top thing people want to see when they go to New York. And it was actually a gift from France to the United States in 1886. And it's a symbol of freedom and liberty. Alright, and the next place is Central Park. This park is huge. You can see this picture from the sky, right? All the buildings here, and then Central Park is just all in the middle right here. It's 2.5 miles long, or also about 4 kilometers long. So look, from here to here is 4 kilometers. So it's huge, and if you look on Google Maps, you'll see it. And here's another picture. Look, there's lots of things you can do in Central Park. You can ride boats in this lake. You can just take a walk. There's a zoo. There's a really famous zoo in Central Park. Maybe you've seen the movie called Madagascar. That's where the zoo that they came from was in Central Park. Look, here there's even a golf course. So there's a lot of things you can do in Central Park. All right, and then Broadway and the Theater District. So what is this? This is like I said before, New York is one of the centers of American culture and Western culture. So here in the U.S. is like the most famous place to go see theaters and the theater and plays. So this is where people go watch like shows and all of these like classic American traditional um, shows and plays at the theater. All right, and the next one is the Empire State Building. So this is one of the most famous skyscrapers in New York and also the world. This building actually used to be the tallest building in the world, but it's not anymore. Now the tallest building is in like Dubai in the United Arab Emirates, but until 1971, this was the tallest building in the world. And it was actually built in 1931, so it's been around for almost 100 years now, about 91 years now. So that building is 91 years old. Can you believe that? All right, and then Times Square. So Times Square is kind of like the center of Manhattan. It's like a really bright place. There's look all these like electronic billboards, giant advertisements, taxis. This is the place where whenever you see a movie about New York City, they're always in Times Square. And here on New Year's Eve, it has one of the most famous New Year's Eve celebrations in the world. There's a giant ball, and at New Year's Eve it drops at midnight. And it's always crowded here. You can't ever come here and there's no people. Like whenever you go to this place, it's always crowded and full of people. Okay, so now let's look at these questions. Which of these sites would you like to visit? Which one is the most interesting for you and why? And are there any other things that you want to do in New York City that we didn't talk about here? So you can take a few minutes and answer these questions. And also, I want you to make a list of the top 5 places that you think tourists should go in your city. So think about your own city or your town and think about the top 5 places you would want a tourist to see and explain why you chose those places. So you can take like maybe 5 or 10 minutes and talk about this to yourself or write it down or whatever you want to do. And then you can come back. Alright, so now let's talk about New York City and films. So which movies or programs do you know that are set in New York City, and can you describe them? So take a couple minutes and think of some movies you've seen or maybe some programs or shows that you watch where it's filmed in New York City. The people are in New York. And describe what is the show about? Alright, so maybe you've heard of this film, it's pretty famous, King Kong. This is one of the most famous films that was shot in New York City. You can see right here the Empire State Building that we talked about before. Also the show Friends. This is a pretty popular show that takes place in New York. And then we have Ghostbusters, also in New York. And Home Alone 2, it's like an American Christmas film and it takes place in New York. The second one, you can even see it, Lost in New York. And then also one of the most popular movies from last year, Spider-Man No Way Home, was filmed in New York City. So have you seen any of these? And if you have, how did you like it? Alright, so now let's talk about some questions about the city. So, would you prefer to live in the city or the suburbs, and why? Remember, the suburbs is like the outside of the city. It's like you have to go kind of far to get to the city. It's just like single houses. It's more quiet. The city is loud. So, which one would you prefer, city or suburbs? And after every question, you can pause the video and come back when you're ready. Alright, now what about driving or public transportation in the city? Would you prefer to drive or use public transportation? And now let's talk about what are some advantages of living in a city and what are some disadvantages of living in a city? Why is living in a city good or why is it bad? So maybe you can say like living in a city is good because there's lots of things to do, you won't get bored, you can go to the store, it's close to your house and you don't have to have a car. Maybe disadvantages are it's too crowded, it's too noisy, there's too much traffic. So think about some and come back. Alright, and do you know the neighbors who live near you? And what about this? Do you think some cities are becoming too large? And why do you think that? Maybe you might think because there's too much traffic or something, too many people. So do you think it's too large or what? All right, and the last question, what is the trendiest area in your city? And do you enjoy going there? So what does this mean, trendiest area? This means like the area where all of the younger people want to go. Everyone there is taking pictures, posting it on social media. Maybe there's like some nice restaurants there or some fun things to do. It's like the most popular place for young people, the trendiest area. So where is this in your city? All right, and that's the end of the presentation. I hope you all enjoyed it, and I hope you learned some interesting facts. And I look forward to seeing you next time. Bye.